Greetings, Tubaneros. Before I get started today, let me get lubricated with a shot of some good old down-home stuff here. Ah. Yes, indeed. Well, today, as your friendly YouTube leftist, I'm motivated to take an historical look at a particularly thorny issue, the rise of communism in the 20th century. This may sound like so much abstract theoretics of only academic concern in the 21st century, but really not only does this legacy still echo today, and likely will continue to do so for some time to come, it goes to the heart of present-day policies we have to endure at this very moment. I know before I even begin that this video's page is going to be darkened by the usual cast of trolls, so let me state from the get-go that conspiracy theories about Jewish bankers are essentially bullshit, as anyone with 2 brain cells and an IQ beyond a single digit should know, and the German gold subsidizing London and the Bolsheviks marginal at best. The Allied subsidies to the Russian government were instead more to the point being that communism, as known and practiced and loved worldwide in the 20th century, was an outgrowth of war. Wars that communists did not start, but that they ended up finishing. This was true in Russia in 1918, in Eastern Europe after World War II, and in China and other nations of Pacific Asia at that same time. This was true in the post-war anti-colonial movements and in Latin America. The relationship between total war and the rise of totalitarianism has long been noted in the official historiography, but it is usually divorced from the social and political context of its origins. This relationship is conveniently presented as stemming from the radical ideology of marginal groups, while ignoring the actual behavior of those who incited and profited from it. The starting point is Lenin's dictum of turning the imperialist war, that is, the Great Crusade for national glory and honor of 1914, Woodrow Wilson's war to end all war, to make the world safe for democracy, to turn that war into an international civil war. This succeeded in Russia and came close in other places in World War I era Europe. This came to pass not from ideology, but from the ugly reality forced upon nations and societies by their responsible ruling circles. Much has been written in the West concerning the horrors of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, as if these fell out of the sky from outer space, thanks to London coming back home in a sealed German train, as if the preceding 4 years of bloodshed were just incidental. However, let me read to you the World War I correspondence of a Jewish writer and relief agent of the Russian government, the Russian Jewish writer known by his pseudonym of Esansky, as he toured the Austrian-Russian front in early 1915, coming from this volume translated as The Enemy at His Pleasure. Reading thusly, beginning at page 85. In my heated freight car, I found a young officer with an intelligent face, and we got to talking. There was something a bit odd about his rigid, dreamy stare and his habit of slowly weighing each word before he spoke. I wondered if he was quite right, or quite all right. You know, he said as we got better acquainted, you know, when I was young I led a shameful life. I drank, I debauched, I beat the young soldiers, and I did other wicked things. Then I came across Leo Tolstoy's What Do I Believe In? I read it, and I was reborn. I became a completely different person. I even stopped eating meat. And yet you go to war, and you kill people, I said. He sat a while, with a downcast head. At last he murmured with deep conviction, war is a different matter. This war will renew the world. It will cleanse mankind of its dirt. For such a goal one can make the supreme sacrifice. The medical corps I was joining had been established with funds provided by some members of the State Duma. Demidov had been put in charge. A thin, nervous man in his 40s, he had a thick beard and large, dreamy, mystical eyes. Though he looked for all the world like an aristocrat, his face and gestures had a strange, almost peasant-like simplicity, as such as you find among sectarians. We talked about the war. Demidov spoke in a mystical tone and was convinced that the fighting would renew mankind. He repeated almost word for word what the Tolstoyan officer had said to me on the train. Igor Platonovich, I exclaimed, I've been in the thick of the war for 3 months now, and I've seen a lot of soldiers. I've seen men who have looked death in the face, soldiers who have killed and been wounded, but I haven't seen anyone who has been renewed. The liar is still a liar, the thief is still a thief, perhaps even a greater one. There are the same intrigues, and a medal is still the highest goal a soldier can strive for. No, Igor Platonovich, bloodshed won't bring any renewal of mankind. Demidov sat gazing silently at me. Finally, he said, as if to himself, "How can you prove that bloodshed is a sin and not a supreme act of heroism? The war's ability to cleanse mankind and renew the human soul was evident in the pogroms and atrocities that occurred. When I met people from the army and the welfare organizations, I could see how even they had grown more savage with each passing day and were losing their moral foundations. At the outbreak of the war, the Russian intelligentsia had protested the German atrocities, which they contrasted with their own soldiers' humanitarian attitude toward the enemy. But very soon other opinions were heard. "I don't understand our sympathy for the enemy," said an old lawyer in my sleeping car. He was an agent for a relief organization. "If they fire at us, we have the right to fire at them. If they kill Russian POWs and raze our towns, we have the right to do the same. We have to learn from the Germans and outdo them." Many months later, I found something rather interesting, which reminded me of my conversation with Demidov. I noticed that officers who had fought in battles and had met the enemy face to face looked and behaved with a mystical serenity. They spoke softly, slowly, never grew excited. They seemed to have grasped a great truth that made them calm. I wondered if this was the renewal Demidov had talked about. Later, I reached a different conclusion. Perhaps the lust for bloodshed has stayed with man since his animal beginnings. Perhaps blood keeps him calm, while the lack of it makes him nervous, so he tries to appease his passion for it. Perhaps people who have shed blood are so tranquil because they have sated their need. I was shocked by the idea, but the more officers I met who had actually fought, the more I was convinced it had merit. There we have an example of what was then called war psychosis at the time, and now called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It seems to affect not only individuals, but also grips entire nations and societies. National leaders went to war in 1914 to further their own aggrandizement and drafted millions of civilian men to realize these ambitions. This is hardly ever seriously criticized by mainstream academia. It's just normal politics as usual. Any social breakdowns, any fragmentation of nations or on class or ethnic fault lines that result are explained away as sui generis phenomena, unrelated to the context in which they emerged, because to do so to videos exposes their values, and possibly yours, to hard criticism that does not further self-righteous, patriotic historiography. Thus, the collapse of Russia's war effort has nothing to do with the Tsarist state's incapacity to defeat a better developed adversary, not to the insistence of its Entente allies that it continue fighting against its own people's best interests. No, no, no. It was because of German treason in high places and the Jews. The collapse of the Tsar and of the successive provisional government had nothing to do with pursuing war policies precisely to short-circuit democracy at home. No, again, it was because of the Kaiser's gold deposited to London and international banks, run again by the Jews. Of course, political democracy was impossible in a country like Russia without social democracy, as remains the case in what was once called the Third World. For this reason, the so-called political democrats of the provisional government were fighting the socialist movement at home as much as the Germans, and thus no wonder why their narrow view caused their defeat by both forces. The violence of the Russian state, projected outward in 1914 as just described by Ansky in Austrian Galicia, was turned inward exactly as Lenin advocated, but it could not have been done without those years of war in the first place. Admitting that, however, exposes the false presumptions of that war exactly as Ansky did at its very beginnings. And so it went through the 20th century. The German Revolution in 1918 was set to follow the Russian model, and would have, if not for the German army's timely agreement to an armistice. The Western powers agreed to this rather than occupation, precisely because of the ongoing Russian experience. Revolutionary movements followed in the post-war collapse of Austria-Hungary. Even in Italy and Spain, which experienced little direct fighting, there was no escape from the social fissures unleashed by the Great War, as it was once quaintly known. The Spanish Civil War was seen as the dress rehearsal for World War II, 20 years after the first one, but who began it? Stalin? The USSR? No, Spanish fascists, trying to overthrow an elected socialist government with open military help from Hitler and Mussolini. Communism swallowing half of post-war Europe could not have been possible without Hitler's anti-communist, nationalist aggression to the east. Those who pontificated on the rollback of communism during the Cold War conveniently forgot that their appeasement of fascism in the 30s led to its rollback in the 1940s by the Soviet Army. Only another war of such epic proportions could have then reversed the tide, and this war was not tried in large part because of communist success after the initial Western patriotic crusades. Remember Stalin's dictum, as quoted by the Yugoslav dissident communist Milovan Djilas. This war is not like wars of the past. It Today, a victorious power must impose its own social system as far as its armies can reach. The victory of communism in China, Indochina, and Korea reinforced the case. The defeat of that other major power of the anti-comintern pact, Japan, set off wars of national resistance led by communist forces, whose leaders took the mantle of post-war leadership by right of said resistance. There was no other domestic party capable of doing so. Communist victory in South Korea, South Vietnam, Japan, Malaysia, and the Philippines was stopped at the time only by the presence of Western combat troops with boots on the ground. Interestingly, the Cold War turned hottest in East Asia precisely because it was so far removed from both Moscow, Washington, and, of course, Europe. No one wanted another round of war in Europe, but Asia and its peoples and their blood were conveniently remote enough to become expendable for post-war global power struggles. The post-war colonial wars dovetailed with this communist-led insurgency in East Asia. The anti-colonial wars in Algeria and Black Africa, the anti-imperial regimes established in Indonesia, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were not communist, but found themselves on the same footing when confronting Western capitalist powers. Hence the Western view that non-alignment was just as subversive as open communist intent. Even the Cuban Revolution bears this out. Beginning as an insurrection against a pro-U.S. right-wing dictator, ostensibly to restore democracy and national sovereignty, the Cuban Revolution in power found itself in a revolt against the entire society in which that dictatorship had rested, including its American advisors. The revolution morphed from non-alignment, from continued war on counter-revolution, to a realignment with the communist movement's international civil war against imperialism, as advocated by Lenin in the seemingly different, distant world of World War I. But if the world of the Cold War was not so different from that of 1914, it's our age substantially different. We're all part of, as citizens or victims, great powers rehashing the same old cliches of conquest, wars for democracy, of culture and values, against dark forces out there among the armies of the night. If the war of 1914 gave birth to Bolshevism and fascism, and that of 1939 cemented the rising red sun from Shanghai to Berlin, what will our wars unleash? They're led by the same complacent politicians, generals, and profiteers who drowned the 20th century by their own actions, and the consequences flowing therefrom in oceans of blood. Our victorious powers still impose their own social systems as far as their armies can reach, or their proxies as in Libya. Perhaps this time it will be different, but not as the war planners intend, as things just never, judging by the record, ever go according to their ill-conceived plans. Here we go again. Hello? Why, it's H.G. Wells, author of those classic science fiction social commentary pieces from the turn of the last century. Well, I'm sorry for you, old Herb, but the truth turned out even more terrible than anything you ever wrote. Just ask your fellow Brit dystopian George Orwell. What's that? The present age is the only one that can fulfill your prophecies. The world of the 20th century was still too backward to reap the full reward of its own idiocy. But now we are in a position to have invisible men, or genetically modified cyborgs, or genocidal military machines as efficient as invaders from Mars, all of which might reduce humanity to divergent species of Eloi and Morlocks after the final devastation of Earth. So you're saying that Edwin Starr was right about war. It's good for absolutely nothing. Well, maybe there's some glimmer of hope. Remember the last lines from The Time Machine, how your time traveler saw in the growing pile of civilization only a foolish heaping that must inevitably fall back upon and destroy its makers in the end? If that is so, it must remain for us to live as though it were not, so that perhaps there will be concrete witness that even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude and a mutual tenderness still lived on in the heart of man.